Welcome to The History of Somalia, a journey through time, where the sands of time whisper tales of an ancient land, a land of resilience, beauty, and untold stories. From the bustling ports of ancient trade routes to the legendary sultanates that once ruled the Indian Ocean. From the poetry of kings to the echoes of colonial struggles, Somalia's past is rich, complex, and deeply inspiring. This is Somali Nexus, your gateway to the history, culture, and legacy of a land that has shaped civilizations, challenged empires, and fostered a spirit of unbreakable unity. Join us as we travel back in time, unraveling the mysteries of the Land of Punt, exploring the rise of the powerful Ajuran Empire, and witnessing the influence of poets, scholars, and warriors who shaped the Horn of Africa. We'll bring to life the voices of ancestors, the wisdom of elders, and the aspirations of generations. Through captivating narratives, expert insights, and vivid storytelling, the history of Somalia invites you to rediscover a land where the past meets the present. Subscribe now to Somali Nexus and embark on this unforgettable journey through history. Let's uncover the stories that shaped a nation, the echoes that still resonate, and the legacy that continues to inspire. This is more than history. It's a journey through time.
Let's jump right in. Today we're tackling Somali history and going way deeper than the usual headlines. We've got some excerpts from what looks like a serious historical text, and let me tell you, Somalia's story is packed with surprises.
Yeah, it really is. Somalia doesn't always get the spotlight, but its history is full of twists and turns. We're talking ancient civilizations, influential empires, real resilience. It's shaped their identity in a big way.
Totally. So let's rewind the clock. Way back. Ancient times. Most people probably don't picture ancient Egyptians when they think of Somalia, but that's where this all starts, with the mysterious Land of Punt.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about how connected the ancient world actually was. Egyptians were sailing already to Punt, which historians think was probably in modern-day Somalia. They were after frankincense and myrrh, so Punt had something valuable to offer.
And get this, the Punt civilization, they were known for being amazing shipbuilders. Their trade routes stretched all the way to Mesopotamia, Persia, even India. Makes you wonder what else they were capable of.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We only get these glimpses into their world through the Egyptian records. But being part of such a huge trade network says a lot about their skills and their society.
It's wild to think about those ancient connections. So how do we get from the Land of Punt to the powerful sultanates that controlled so much of Somali history?
Well, you can almost draw a line straight from those early societies to those centralized power structures. One of the most famous is the Ajuran Sultanate. They were around from the 13th to the 17th centuries, known for their incredible military structures and their ability to hold off the Portuguese.
Oh yeah, the Portuguese were a force to be reckoned with. What was it about the Ajuran Sultanate that allowed them to become so powerful? What set them apart?
Their agricultural skills played a huge role. They mastered irrigation-based farming, which meant a steady food supply, and that's key for a strong economy. Plus, they had a government system rooted in Islamic law, which gave them structure for administration and justice.
So they weren't just powerful, they were organized and pretty forward-thinking for their time. Didn't their influence extend across a lot of East Africa, too?
Oh, absolutely. They were major players in the region's trade and politics. Left a lasting legacy, you can still see it today. But they weren't the only sultan shaping Somali history. There was also the Galedi Sultanate. They came to power in the 18th century.
The Galedi Sultanate, huh? What's their story? Were they as expansion-focused as the Ajuran?
They were a little different. They definitely held power, but they seemed more concerned with keeping peace and stability within their territory.
So more about keeping things running smoothly than conquering new lands?
Seems that way. And they held on to power well into the 20th century, which tells you they were pretty successful at maintaining order and growing their economy.
That's impressive, considering all the upheaval happening around them. Okay, so we've got the Ajuran, who are all about expansion, and the Galedi, who are more about stability. Any other major players in this sultanate game?
You bet. In the 19th century, the Midrazan Sultanate rose to prominence. They controlled maritime trade, the real masters of the sea lanes, plus they had this clever system of taxation, pretty sophisticated for its time, which really boosted their economy.
Wow, so they were like the merchant kings of the Somali coast. It's incredible how these different sultanates had their own strengths and strategies.
Yeah, it speaks to the diversity and the ever-changing nature of Somali history. And all of this is built on a foundation of maritime activity and trade. Remember the Land of Punt?
Oh, yeah, those ancient seafarers. So you're saying there's a connection between them and these powerful sultanates centuries later?
Totally. Somalia's location is key here. The Horn of Africa connecting Arabia and East Africa. It's a natural hub for trade, and that goes way back.
So the Punt civilization, in a way, laid the groundwork for the maritime power that we see with those later sultanates.
You could say that. And then, between the 7th and 10th centuries, you have Arab and Persian traders arriving, bringing Islam with them. They set up shop along the coast, and some of those trading posts, well, they eventually became those powerful sultanates we were talking about.
It's like this chain reaction through history. Ancient seafarers to powerful sultanates, all connected by trade and Somalia's strategic location.
Exactly. But Somalia's story isn't just about the coast. The interior played a huge role too, drawing explorers and adventurers from all over.
So now we're heading England.
We are. And this exploration of the Somali interior was partly spurred by the British taking over Aden in 1839. Suddenly, everyone was interested in the region. European powers were all trying to get a foothold, vying for control.
Here come the colonial rivalries. It's like a historical treasure hunt, with everyone wanting a piece of Somalia. Who were some of the big names in this exploration game?
Well, there are some fascinating characters. You've got Richard Burton, famous for his journey to Harar in 1854. That expedition gave us valuable knowledge about the region's culture and geography.
Richard Burton, now there's a legend. A real-life Indiana Jones type. Any other explorers who really shaped our understanding of Somalia?
Definitely. Charles Gann, he was meticulous. He documented the coast, ventured to England, collected tons of information, geographic details, cultural insights. His work is a goldmine for historians.
It's incredible to think about what they went through, exploring uncharted territory, encountering different cultures. I bet not all these expeditions ended well, though.
Sadly, you're right. Take Karl Klaus von der Decken, for example. He met a tragic end while exploring the Juba River in 1865. A stark reminder of the risks these explorers faced.
It really shows you the price some paid in the pursuit of knowledge. But despite those dangers, these explorations were crucial for mapping out the Somali Peninsula, right?
Absolutely. They were piecing together the geography, the cultures, the whole picture, and all of this was happening alongside major migrations and shifts within Somalia itself.
So while these explorers are charting the land, the Somali people are on the move too.
Exactly. Imagine Somalia back in the 10th century. You have Somali nomads and Oromo pastoralists moving south from the Gulf of Aden. And at the same time, Arab and Berber Muslims are setting up trading towns on the coast, bringing their own cultures and faith with them.
Wow, it sounds like a real melting pot of cultures and traditions. What kind of impact did that have?
It was a period of huge change. Islam takes root in major ports like Vela, Berbera, Mogadishu. It becomes a defining force in Somali society. And these ports weren't just local hubs. We're talking connections that reached all the way to China.
All the way to China. That's insane. So you've got internal migrations, the arrival of Islam, this booming trade network. Anyone else in the mix?
You also had the Bantu tribes of the Nika Confederacy with their ancient capital at Shonwaya. And then there were the Wariabi, skilled hunters, similar to the San people you see in other parts of Africa. They added another layer of cultural diversity to Somalia.
It's mind-boggling how many different groups were converging in this region. It must have been a fascinating but also a super complex time.
It definitely was. And some of these migrations had a long-lasting impact. For example, when Sheikh Ismail Jabarti arrived from Arabia in the 11th century, it was a big deal. He's considered the ancestor of the Darood Somali, one of the major Somali clans.
So he added a new lineage to the Somali clan system.
Yeah, and his descendants played a major role in shaping Somali history. Then you have Sheikh Isaac arriving around the same time, and that led to the rise of the Isaac Somali, another influential clan. So now you've got them, plus the existing Somali and Oromo groups. It's this complex web of clans competing for land and resources.
So these migrations weren't just about people moving, they were about power dynamics and shaping Somali society.
Exactly. And all of this is playing out against the backdrop of the powerful Ethiopian Christian kingdom to the west and the Muslim sultanates all around. The Somali clans were caught in the middle, sometimes even joining Muslim armies to fight against the Christian kingdom.
Sounds like a pretty volatile time. Religion and politics all tangled up, influencing the fate of the Somali people.
Definitely. And right in the middle of this turmoil, you see the Muslim state of it all rising up. They directly challenged the Christian Amhara kingdom. It was a clash of civilizations with huge consequences for the whole region.
Wow, a real clash of civilizations. That sounds intense. Who were the major players in this conflict?
On the Adal side, you have Ahmed ibn Ibrahim el-Ghazi, known as Ahmed Gui. He was an incredible military leader, and he almost took down the entire Ethiopian kingdom.
He almost conquered Ethiopia. That's wild. What stopped him?
Well, the Portuguese stepped in 1542 and sided with the Ethiopians. That intervention stopped the Somali from expanding further west and completely changed the power dynamics in the Horn of Africa.
Talk about a twist. So the Portuguese, busy building their own empire, end up playing a decisive role in Somali history.
Yep, and that brings us to a new era in Somali history. Clan dynamics are shifting, trade is still a major force, and now you've got European colonialism looming on the horizon.
This is where things get really complicated. Ancient civilizations, powerful sultanates, migrations, a clash of civilizations. What's next in this whirlwind tour of Somali history?
Get ready to dive deeper into the world of Somali clans, the rise of European powers, and the fierce resistance that shaped the Somali nation. It's a story that'll challenge what you think you know about Somalia.
Last time, we left off with those European powers making their move on Somalia. Let's fast forward to the 19th century. What was happening on the ground then?
Well, things were pretty dynamic. You had these powerful Somali clans controlling important ports like Berbera, Zayla, Mogadishu. They weren't just economic hubs, they were centers of power too. The Galeti clan, for example, they had a lot of influence in the Lower Shabelle region.
So these Somali clans, they're holding on to these key trade routes. How do they react when European powers start trying to muscle their way in?
It's a tricky situation, right? Somalia had all these connections to the outside world, which brought in new things, new ideas, but it also opened the door for European powers to come in and try to take control. They saw Somalia's resources, and they wanted a piece of the action.
Yeah, sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It was. You have Britain, they're focused on that northern coast. They need that Aden coaling station, plus they rely on Somali meat imports. France, they don't want to be left out, so they grab Obak and start building up Djibouti. It's all about strategy, each power trying to outmaneuver the other.
So it's Britain versus France fighting over control of the Somali coast. Who else joins in on this colonial free-for-all?
Italy throws their hat in the ring too. They set up at Assab, which eventually became Eritrea. They even tried to claim a protectorate over Ethiopia through a treaty with Emperor Menelik. But Menelik, well, he had other ideas.
Hold on, Italy tried to take over Ethiopia. How did that work out for them?
Not so well. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces, led by Menelik himself, totally crushed the Italians. It was a huge upset. It really shook the colonial world. And it inspired a lot of resistance movements across Africa.
That's a turning point for sure. You can claim a protectorate, but actually enforcing it, that's a different story. So how did this defeat change things for the colonial powers?
It forced them to rethink their strategy. They drew up new treaties, changed the borders in Somalia, and Ethiopia ended up with control of the Ogaden and parts of the Had. Problem was, these decisions often ignored what the Somali communities wanted. It divided up their land and set the stage for future conflicts.
A classic case of colonial powers carving up Africa without much thought for the people actually living there. How did the Somali people respond to all this? Did they just accept European control?
Not a chance. They resisted fiercely. And one figure who embodied that resistance was Muhammad Abdul Hassan. The British called him the Mad Mullah, but that's a really offensive term that completely misrepresents him.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that nickname. Mad Mullah seems pretty dismissive. So who was this guy, and what made him such a powerful leader?
He was from the Ogaden clan, a devout follower of the Aliya religious order, and a gifted speaker, really charismatic. He commanded respect and loyalty, and his message resonated with a lot of Somalis who were tired of foreign interference. At first, he actually cooperated with the authorities, but over time, because of disputes and that growing European and Ethiopian pressure, he decided to take a stand.
So what pushed him from cooperation to outright resistance?
It was a combination of things. He clashed with a Christian mission, there were disagreements with the administration, but I think the main trigger was the way European and Ethiopian powers kept encroaching on Somaliland. It threatened their way of life, their independence.
So you have his faith, personal experiences, and the desire to protect Somali territory, all coming together.
Exactly. And that led to the creation of the Dervish movement, which he led with incredible skill. He understood how the Somali clans worked, how to unite them, and he called for Muslim solidarity, which was a powerful force that cut across clan lines.
Smart move. Uniting those different clans in a place where clan identity was so important, that must be really tough.
Yeah, it was, and his success says a lot about his leadership. And people were really angry about those foreign powers. Plus, with access to more weapons, the dervishes became a real threat to those British, Italian, even Ethiopian campaigns.
So they weren't just resisting peacefully, they were fighting back. How effective were they in those fights?
They were surprisingly good. The dervishes, they mastered guerrilla warfare, using the terrain to their advantage. The European armies were bigger, but they were clunky. The dervishes could move fast, hit hard, and disappear. The British really struggled to deal with them.
It's amazing how often guerrilla tactics worked against those colonial armies. So the dervishes, they actually gave the British a run for their money.
Oh yeah, In fact, in 1910, they forced the British to pull back from the region altogether. That was a huge win for Sayyid Muhammad and the dervishes.
They forced the British to retreat. That's incredible. But I bet the British didn't just give up, did they?
Nope, not a chance. They regrouped, formed a special camel unit, and launched a counteroffensive. It all culminated in 1920 with the defeat of the dervishes. A sad end to a movement that had fought so bravely for Somali independence.
What a story. Inspiring and tragic at the same time. So is that it then? The dervish movement is crushed, and the colonial powers are firmly in control.
For a while, yes, but that spirit of resistance never really died. The dervishes became a symbol of Somali resilience, an inspiration for future generations. And it set the stage for the fight for independence, which really gained momentum after World War II.
So even in defeat, the dervishes planted the seeds for change. How did World War II affect Somalia and its path to independence?
It was a game changer. The British took back British Somaliland and Italian Somalia during the war. Ethiopia also became independent again, and for a short time, all those Somali territories were unified under the British military.
Interesting how global conflicts can sometimes lead to these moments of unity, but I'm guessing it didn't last.
You're right, it was a brief moment. British Somaliland went back to the Colonial Office in 1948. The Ogaden and the Hod, even though Somalis claimed them, went to Ethiopia. And Italian Somali became a UN trust territory, the idea being to prepare it for independence in the next 10 years or so.
So now you've got two separate Somali territories on different paths to independence, but with those colonial powers still calling the shots. Did those different colonial approaches have an impact on how they developed?
That's a good question. The British and the Italians, they had different ways of doing things, different priorities, and those differences definitely influenced how each territory developed, both politically and economically. But despite those differences, the Somali people, they never stopped wanting unity.
So even though they were divided by colonial borders, the dream of a unified Somalia was still alive.
Oh yeah. And that dream became a reality on June 26, 1960. British Somaliland got its independence. Then, just a few days later, on July 1st, Italian Somalia followed suit. They joined together, and the Somali Republic was born. It was a huge moment, full of celebration and hope. The Somali people had finally achieved their goal of becoming one nation.
Must have felt like a brand new start. But I imagine trying to build a unified nation from two separate colonies came with its own set of challenges, right?
Of course. You had to merge the legal and judicial systems, which wasn't easy. Imagine trying to combine two completely different operating systems. And then there was the issue of communication and transportation between the regions. Those things needed work too.
Logistical hurdles, for sure. But were there political challenges as well? How did they form a government that represented both of those former colonies?
The first government was a coalition, the Somali Youth League, or SYL, they were from the south, and then the Somali National League, the SNL, they were from the north. The idea was to balance things out, make sure both former colonies had a voice.
A coalition government makes sense. But on top of all these internal challenges, there was this powerful idea that really took hold in Somalia, the idea of Greater Somalia.
Yeah, Greater Somalia, it really captured people's imaginations. It was this vision of bringing together all Somali-speaking communities, the ones in the Ogaden, French Somaliland, which is Djibouti today, even parts of Kenya. And this idea had a huge impact on Somali foreign policy. It drove a lot of their decisions and shaped their relationships with their neighbors.
So it wasn't just about unifying those two former colonies, it was about uniting all Somalis, even across existing borders. Ambitious for sure, but also sounds like it could cause problems. How did those neighboring countries react to this Greater Somalia idea?
Not well. Predictably, the Somali government supporting self-determination for those Kenyan Somalis really strained relations with Britain and even sparked a guerrilla war in northern Kenya. And then you had that Somali uprising in the Ogaden, challenging Ethiopian control, led to armed conflict there too.
So Greater Somalia put the new republic on a collision course with its neighbors. How did they handle all that tension, especially with the Cold War going on in the background?
It was a tough balancing act. When the West sided with Ethiopia and Kenya, Somalia turned to the Soviet Union for military help. And that gave them the support they needed, but it also pulled them deeper into that Cold War rivalry.
A classic example of how the Cold War played out in these smaller conflicts all over the world. So how did this Greater Somalia foreign policy work out in the long run?
It had its ups and downs. Sometimes there were periods of calm, sometimes things heated up again. For example, in 1967, Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Begum became prime minister. He tried to ease tensions with Kenya and Ethiopia, and for a while it worked. Things calmed down a bit.
So a more practical approach, at least for a time. But I have a feeling things didn't stay peaceful for long.
You're right. In 1969, the presidential elections were a mess. 64 different parties competing for power. It was pure chaos, a clear sign of instability.
Wow, 64 parties. That's a recipe for disaster. So what happened? Did they manage to form a government out of all that?
No. Tragically, things took a dark turn when President Rashid Ali Shermarke was assassinated. It threw the country into turmoil, created a power vacuum, and that vacuum was quickly filled by the military.
An assassination. That's never a good sign. So who stepped in to fill the void?
Major General Mohammed Siad Barre, he was the army commander. He seized control in a military coup. It was a turning point in Somali history, the start of authoritarian rule, and what he called scientific socialism.
Scientific socialism, huh? That sounds interesting, but maybe a little ominous too. Who was Siad Barre and what was his vision for Somalia?
Siad Barre, well, he was a complicated figure. Controversial, to say the least. He took control, crushed any opposition, no mercy, launched these campaigns against poverty, disease, ignorance, presented himself as a kind of father figure looking out for his people, and he called the coup a revolution to make it sound legitimate, to get people on his side.
So he was a charismatic leader, used to social programs, and also repression to stay in power. But what exactly was scientific socialism?
It was his own mix of socialist ideology with Somali traditions. He claimed it was compatible with Islam, a pretty bold statement. He was trying to bridge that gap between socialism and religious belief.
That's an interesting mix, but how did this scientific socialism actually work in practice? Was it about progress, or was it just about consolidating power?
It was both, really. To strengthen his position, he got closer to the Soviet Union and China, distanced Somalia from the West. And to control things at home, he created a whole system of surveillance and repression.
So behind all the talk of progress and revolution, there was a darker side to his rule.
Unfortunately, yes, he used the Victory Pioneers, a national youth group, basically as enforcers. His own son-in-law was in charge of the National Security Service, a brutal intelligence agency, and if you spoke out against him, you ended up in the national security courts, and those are known for their harsh punishments.
Sounds like a classic authoritarian regime, social programs as a cover for repression. How did ordinary Somalis experience the system? Did they buy into this scientific socialism?
It was a mixed bag. Siad Barre changed rural life, created regional committees, put clan elders under state control. That disrupted the traditional power structures. He even made it illegal to talk about clan loyalty, hoping to wipe out those allegiances and create a new national identity centered around his ideology.
So he was trying to dismantle the traditional clan system, replace it with a more centralized, state-controlled system. That sounds like it would create a lot of resistance. How successful was he?
It was a bold move, and the results were mixed. His literacy campaigns in the early 70s, those were actually pretty successful. More education, development of a written Somali language using the Latin alphabet, that was good. But trying to suppress clan identities and force his ideology on people, that created resentment. It eventually backfired.
It's a reminder that even the best intentions can have unintended consequences. What happened to Siad Barre and his scientific socialism? Did he succeed in transforming Somalia?
No, he didn't. His rule was brought down by a combination of things: internal opposition, pressure from outside, and a disastrous war that really exposed just how fragile his regime was.
A war? What war are we talking about?
The Ogaden War. It was a conflict that would have a devastating impact on Somalia and the whole region. And it was the beginning of the end for Siad Barre.
We left off with that cliffhanger about the Ogaden War. So what was that all about? And how did it affect Somalia?
It was basically a fight between Somalia and Ethiopia over the Ogaden region, a big chunk of land that was part of Ethiopia, but a lot of Somalis lived there. It was driven by that greater Somalia idea, but there was also this whole Cold War thing going on in the background. The Soviet Union actually switched sides, went from supporting Somalia to backing Ethiopia.
So a land dispute, Cold War politics, and Somalia's ambitions all mixed together. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. How did the war actually play out?
Well, in 77, with Somalia's help, the Western Somali Liberation Front, they attacked Ethiopian forces in the Ogaden. Things were going pretty well for Somalia at first, but then, when the Soviets switched sides and started giving weapons to Ethiopia, everything changed.
Talk about a plot twist. A superpower switching sides mid-conflict. That must have been a huge blow to Somalia.
It was. The Ethiopian army, armed with all that Soviet gear, plus they had Cuban troops helping them, they launched a counterattack and pushed Somalia back. By 78, Somalia had lost. It really weakened the country, not just militarily, but also, people's morale took a hit.
So Greater Somalia took a hit, but this war also had consequences for Siad Barre back home, right?
Definitely. That loss in the Ogaden War, it kind of exposed the weaknesses in Siad Barre's whole scientific socialism thing. Clan-based opposition groups, they'd been simmering under the surface, and now they saw a chance to challenge him. The Somali Salvation Democratic Front, the SSDF, and the Somali National Movement, the SNM, they both started gaining power.
It's like the war tore things open, revealed all those deep clan divisions and resentment that Siad Barre had been trying to keep under control.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And things were about to get much worse. Siad Barre, trying to stabilize things, he signed a peace deal with Ethiopia in '88. They agreed to stop supporting each other's rebel groups. But here's the thing, that move actually pushed the S&M to launch their own attack in northern Somalia. They didn't trust him.
Wait, so a peace agreement designed to reduce conflict actually ended up escalating it?
Crazy, right? That S&M offensive in the north had set off a brutal civil war that engulfed the whole country. The Ogaden Somali, who had fought for Siad Barre in the Ogaden War, they felt betrayed by that peace deal. They turned against him. Siad Barre's regime was already weak from the war, and now it started to fall apart.
Sounds like a classic domino effect, one thing leading to another, and it just spirals out of control.
Yep, Siad Barre, he had to retreat to Mogadishu. His power was slipping away. Clan militias, they popped up everywhere, all fighting for control. In 1991, the United Somali Congress, the USC, overthrew Siad Barre. He went into exile.
So that's the end of Siad Barre and his scientific socialism. Did Somalia finally find peace after all that?
Sadly, no. Taking Siad Barre out of the picture, it didn't bring peace. It made things worse, actually. The S&M, they went ahead and declared independence in the north. They formed the Republic of Somaliland in the south. Different clan factions fought for control of Mogadishu, turned it into a war zone.
So the country is fractured, different clans fighting for power. What happened to the Somali people during all of this?
The civil war was a nightmare. Fighting destroyed everything, infrastructure, farms. It led to famine. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Millions had to flee their homes.
It's hard to even imagine the suffering. How did the rest of the world react to this crisis?
The world was horrified. Images of starving Somali children, they were everywhere on TV. In '92, the U.S. led an intervention, a multinational force. The goal was to stop the fighting and get aid to the people who desperately needed it.
That's the intervention they made that movie Black Hawk Down about, right? That mission didn't end well, did it?
No. The Battle of Mogadishu in '93, when those U.S. soldiers were killed, it showed just how difficult and dangerous the situation was. The U.S. and other Western powers, they started pulling back, and the UN peacekeepers, they struggled to maintain control.
So even with all that international intervention, the conflict just kept going.
Sadly, yes. Those underlying issues, the clan rivalries, the power vacuum, they never really went away. Throughout the '90s, there were all these peace conferences, one after another, but nothing worked. New warlords popped up, and the fighting continued.
So despite all the efforts to make peace, Somalia remained trapped in this cycle of violence.
It did. But there were some bright spots. In '98, they formed the self-governing region of Puntland. It was a sign that people still wanted stability. They wanted something different from the chaos that was engulfing the rest of the country.
So even in all that darkness, there were still people looking for a way forward.
Exactly. And in 2000, they formed a transitional national government, the TNG. They didn't have a lot of power, but it was a step towards rebuilding a functioning state.
Sounds like a very fragile step, but a step nonetheless.
It was, and it led to the creation of the Transitional Federal Government, the TFG, in 2004. They were operating out of Kenya at first because Mogadishu was still too dangerous, but they represented another attempt to bring some kind of order to Somalia.
So despite all the obstacles, they kept trying to rebuild a Somali state.
They did, but the TFG, they faced a whole new set of problems. There was this powerful Islamic movement, the Islamic Courts Union, the ICU. They took advantage of the TFG's weakness and imposed Sharia law in the areas they controlled.
So a new force enters the scene, making an already complicated situation even more complex.
Yeah, and within the ICU, there was this more radical group, Al-Shabaab, that was starting to gain power.
Al-Shabaab, that name, it's become synonymous with terrorism. How did they come about and what did they do to Somalia?
Al-Shabaab, they were basically the armed wing of the ICU, and they were brutal. They wanted to create an Islamic state, and they were willing to use violence and terror to do it. They were a whole new level of threat.
So now, on top of the clan warfare and a weak government, Somalia had to deal with these extremists. How did they handle that?
It was a tough situation. In 2006, the TFG, with help from Ethiopia, launched an attack on the ICU and drove them out of Mogadishu. But that win was short-lived. Al-Shabaab, they just regrouped and came back stronger, started this brutal insurgency.
So the intervention, which was supposed to stabilize things, actually ended up making Al-Shabaab stronger.
Yeah, a classic case of good intentions gone wrong. Al-Shabaab's insurgency, it dragged Somalia back into violence. They targeted everyone, ordinary people, government officials, aid workers, even the African Union peacekeepers who were there to help.
So as the TFG was trying to establish itself, they're also constantly battling Al-Shabaab.
Yep, that was their biggest challenge. But slowly, with help from those African Union troops, the TFG started pushing back against Al-Shabaab. They took back some territory and tried to rebuild some semblance of a state.
It sounds like a long, hard road full of setbacks. Did they ever manage to hold real democratic elections during this period?
Having actual elections with everything going on, that was almost impossible. But in 2012, when the TFG's time was up, Somalia tried to turn a new page. They adopted a new constitution, selected a new parliament, and elected Hassan Sheikh Mohammed as president.
A new president, a new parliament, a new constitution. Sounds like a fresh start. Did it work? Did this new government make any progress?
There were definitely challenges. Al-Shabaab was still around, and there were accusations of corruption of the government. But there were good things, too. The economy started to improve a little, and they worked on rebuilding the army.
A glimmer of hope after so many years of struggle. Did it last? Were they able to hold those direct elections they were planning?
No, they couldn't. With all the security problems and political disagreements, it was just too risky. The situation was still very unstable. And then in 2021, they made this controversial decision to extend the terms of the parliament and the president. That caused a lot of protests and showed how divided the country still was.
So even with a new government and some signs of progress, Somalia still faced these huge challenges.
Absolutely. But even with all that, people still wanted peace. They still wanted democracy. They finally went back to that 2020 election agreement and held indirect elections in 2022. Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, he was elected again, faced with the same massive task, rebuilding a nation that had been shattered by decades of conflict.
Wow, Somalia's journey, it's been a roller coaster, hasn't it? Moments of hope, then setbacks, then hope again. What can we learn from all of this?
I think it shows us that building a stable, successful nation, it's incredibly hard, especially in a place like Somalia with all those deep clan divisions and a history of outside interference.
It's a reminder that there are no easy solutions, and even when you make progress, it can be so fragile.
Exactly. But the Somali people, they're incredibly resilient. They've been through so much, but they haven't given up. They're still striving for a better future.
Their story, it really challenges the way we often think about Somalia. It's not just about conflict and instability. It's a complex story with a lot of layers. What a journey this has been. From ancient civilizations to colonial struggles, from civil war to terrorism. Somalia's history is full of resilience, ambition, tragedy, and hope.
It reminds us that history is never simple. If we want to understand the present, if we want to build a better future, we have to understand the past.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Somali history. We've barely scratched the surface, but hopefully this has given you a new perspective on this fascinating country.
It's a story that needs to be told, a story that, despite all the challenges, has a lot to teach us. And who knows, maybe one day the Somali people will finally get the peace and prosperity they deserve.